That brings us to section 11. What were the characteristics of the rise of the Cold War? Well, remember, World War II, Britain, France were the capitalist liberal democracies on one side, and the Soviet Union on the other side. What brought them together was they were both the enemies of Nazi Germany. They didn't share ideologies. In fact, they were ideological enemies, right? Great Britain and the United States both said capitalism is awesome, it's going to make your life better. The Soviet Union said capitalism is terrible, it's the worst thing in the world. So what happened is once the Nazis were gotten rid of, these two forces saw each other as enemies, right? And they wanted to do very different things, right? The U.S. wanted to build an alliance of capitalist and liberal democracies to bring economic prosperity and world peace. The Soviet Union wanted to ensure its immediate security through control of territory and by establishing friendly communist states with the idea of a future worldwide communist revolution. You can't have a compromise. Both of these sides see each other as the enemy, and both have plans to spread their ideology throughout the entire world. And what's dangerous is after 1949, both have nuclear weapons. So it's a really scary world. So how did the Soviet, and I've given you kind of a clue, but I'm going to go more into detail here. How did the Soviet Union act immediately after World War II, and why? How did the capitalist liberal democracies respond? So after World War II, because the Soviet Union had lost so many people, right? Germany had invaded and killed all these people. They wanted to seize a bunch of territory as buffer state, as a buffer between any possible invaders. So what happened is when the Soviet Union, remember, they invade Germany from the east, so they conquer Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Germany, part of Germany, all these areas, and they have troops there. And before those soldiers leave, they make sure that each and every one of those countries has a communist government. Most of those countries did not want a communist government. I think with the exception of Yugoslavia, none of them wanted a communist government, but they had no choice. Right? The soldiers made sure that those governments were there in place before they left. So that's how they're going to set up this kind of buffer state. In addition, they'll simply seize territory. Right? Remember in the northwestern part of the Soviet Union on that map, there were three countries, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. They don't even set up a government, a communist government in them. They just take them over. Right? They just flat out just take them over. And their hope is to have security in this way and also to spread communism. So the next question, we'll actually take how did the capitalist liberal democracies and CLDs respond? We'll take that with 4. What role did foreign aid provided by the Marshall Plan play in the capitalist liberal democratic fight against communism? So the communist expansion was a serious threat to the ideals and security of the capitalist liberal democracies. And that's why I have this picture here, like as kind of a reminder. That is a pro-communist demonstration in Greece, the birthplace of Western democracy, right? So if you think about that, right? What if the birthplace of democracy became communist? That doesn't say much for democracy, does it? Right? That's a major threat. But how do you respond? You can't invade, say, Poland or East Germany, because that would immediately lead to World War III. You can't say, hey, we're going to liberate these people. They don't want communism. We're going to come in and free them. That'll lead to World War III. No one wants that. But they can't appease. They can't just say, oh, it's cool. Go ahead and spread communism if you want. That's what people tried to do with Hitler, and it didn't work. Hitler just got stronger and became a major threat. So don't go that appeasement route. So what they did was they said, we need to prevent spread. Right? We need to prevent it spreading. So we're going to concentrate on places like Greece and Turkey, which aren't communist, but face attempts to make them communist. Right? So in countries that might become communist but aren't yet communist, we're going to intervene. Right? Harry Truman will do this through what's called the policy of containment. This is a U.S. president. We're going to try and prevent them from spreading. We're going to fight or support people who are fighting against the spread. And this is called the Truman Doctrine, right? We're going to we'll give financial military aid to any country facing a communist threat. And part of this was in 1948, this thing called the Marshall Plan, which was the idea, hey, we're going to give money and loans to European countries so that they can rebuild. And if they do that, they won't become communist, right? They have a good economy where they have their own property. They won't become communist, right? Remember the mules, right? The mules from that were given to the Greeks. And remember, the Greek guy says, long live America, right? He's a good anti-communist now, right? He's got private property. The Americans helped him get back on his feet. He's going to be anti-communist now. So that's kind of the idea there. One thing I should just point out, just as an aside, a lot of times when we gave them aid, it was conditional on them using the aid to buy American products. So we would say, we're going to loan you money, but you got to buy John Deere tractors. So it was clever on our part too. It made sure we made some money too. We weren't just giving it away. What was oh yeah, Gabrielle?
So in this communist
Mm-hmm.
countries, did you have international trade? Like it was allowed?
They never completely got rid of markets. They never could. They markets worked too effectively. They had their own money, and there was lots of international trade actually between places like Poland and the Soviet Union, and things like that. But they couldn't get rid of it completely. They said that will happen later. So the next question was, what was MAD? Why is it important? And MAD is very simple. It stands for mutually assured destruction, right? Mutually assured destruction. And basically what it means is, if two countries that have nuclear weapons get into a war and they both use them, both will lose. No one wins a nuclear war. They're too terrible, right? You lose, lots and lots of people, lots and lots of resources. And so what that doctrine has meant, why it's important, this is why no countries possessing nuclear weapons have ever fought a war against each other. Right? No countries, you have a country with nuclear weapons fight a country that doesn't have nuclear weapons. But you've never had two countries, each of which had nuclear weapons, have ever fought each other. So it's kind of weird. The threat that we could destroy each other completely made us stop fighting as much. There's still going to be wars, but not wars between two nuclear powers. And that's why everyone wants to be a nuclear power that feels any kind of threat, like North Korea or Iran. What does G.I. Joe tell us about capitalism and liberal democracy in the United States? So the key thing, right, I tried to emphasize was that African Americans faced a lot of discrimination, a lot of difficulties, and despite their efforts, they had a hard time, really getting people to help them. But what happened was, in the Cold War, it created an environment where we said, hey, we believe in freedom and equality. And the communists were like, no, you don't. You guys are discriminating against African American and other people based on race. So this helped lend support to the civil rights movement. Right? Many white people would say, hey, you know what? This is right. We're supposed to be about equality, but our fellow African American citizens are being oppressed, so we should help them in their effort to get their civil rights. And then, led by Martin Luther King, you had these massive changes that bring more that end a lot of legal discrimination against African Americans, and that gives African Americans the freedom to develop economically. Right, so you have the rise of the black middle class. Right, once African Americans are able to get more political rights, that allows them, they're able to use those political rights to participate in the market, to get better jobs and things like that, and they're able to rise economically. So we have the rise of what we call the black middle class. And you could see that success in the, that was in the 60s when a lot of that was happening, 60s and 70s. And remember in the cartoon I showed you from G.I. Joe in the 80s, African Americans played a prominent role. Remember, especially in the PSA one, right? Instead of African American men being presented as threats or presented as kind of comedic figures, they were figures who were helping, right? They were protecting. Remember the one guy, Roadblock, right? He protected the kid from the guy who wanted to hurt him, right? So had this white kid being protected by an African American man in a position of authority. So you had that kind of transformation. Let's see. What problems do the communists face? What do jeans and ice boxes, refrigerators, tell us about those problems? The big problem was, remember, the communists, the Soviet Union said, give up your freedom for a bit. We will develop economically, and because we have the right doctrine and we will develop scientifically, we'll get richer than the capitalist countries and we'll share it more fairly. And then once we do that, you'll get your freedom. They couldn't do it, though. They failed to get to that first step of developing economically. And you could see this because there was someone to compare it to, right? So remember the Soviet Union and the United States, we were in this kind of propaganda war. So we had this thing called the kitchen debate, where in Moscow, or in the Soviet Union, we were, as a kind of propaganda struggle, we set up our own kitchens. And the American kitchen was just clearly better than the Soviet kitchen. And it's not necessarily that we had better technology, but we were able to produce things with our capitalist economy so cheaply that most people could afford those things. Right, so when we presented this kitchen with a refrigerator and a stove. Later we'll have a microwave oven, not in the 70s. Everyone was amazed, right? People were astounded at this, right? Because we were able to do this so well. Just as a funny aside, what's a microwave now? Like $50? Like when we got our first, I was so excited when I was in middle school. We got our first microwave, but it was I think $300, and that was in the late '80s. That's a lot of money. But that's capitalist economies allow you to do that, to produce things like that, innovate, and then make them cheaply enough. So now everyone has a microwave oven. Genes, that just shows us how this communists try to control everything, right? We're not going to let people have genes. They couldn't do fashion, and they wouldn't give people that kind of freedom, right? And we're so obsessed with power and control that they were concerned that people were wearing jeans, right? So they can't give you what you need. They can't even give you that much stuff, right? They're just economically behind, and they won't even really let you even have the freedom to decide what kind of clothing you want to wear. Oh, and that was the picture, right? There's the kitchen debate. What are the characteristics of a command economy? What problems are associated with it? Now, one thing I should stress, first of all, command economy is when you have a central authority, usually the government, telling people what to produce, how to produce it, and for whom to produce it, right? So you have centralized planning. This works really well when a country is trying to industrialize. This worked really well for the Soviet Union in the 1920s. This allowed them to use their resources efficiently. And it's great for doing things like building roads, increasing steel output, increasing electrical capacity, things like that. It's great for that. The problem is, once your economy gets to a certain level of complexity, it doesn't work. The American economy, for example, is too complex. You couldn't have a single person just sit out and plan out what we should do, right? So that's the problem, first of all. And what happens then is that since it can't produce efficiently, you get shortages and things like that. Remember, I gave you this picture. These are women waiting in line to buy shoes, right? Because they're carefully rationing out the shoes. And this also, again, leads to corruption. Because, if I run the shoe store, I run the shoe factory, I'm going to make sure my family gets shoes. Right? That's kind of an issue. The problem also, though, so they're not able to produce adequate, high-quality consumer goods. In general, communist countries, they were not bad at giving people the basic necessities of life. You would have an apartment, it would be small, but you weren't out in the rain. You had a roof. You had basic food, you had enough to eat, basic entertainment, but you couldn't wear the clothes you necessarily wanted to wear. You didn't have nearly enough stuff that the people in the capitalist economies had. So this is the problem. It just can't produce enough consumer goods, in a sense. Good at making jet fighters, bad at making jeans. What led to the fall of the Soviet Union? So in the face of that, it was clear by the late 1980s and early 90s that the Soviet Union was falling behind. It just was not economically keeping up with the West. And so the leader of the Soviet Union, a man named Gorbachev, says, you know what, we need to reform. And he tried to bring radical political and economic reforms at the same time. Basically, he tried to bring in more of a market economy, and he tried to allow more freedom. And people, instead of people saying, oh, thank you very much for this, thank you very much for giving us more freedom, people said, we want more freedom. This isn't enough. And if you've now admitted that there's a problem with communism, right? You've admitted that there's a problem with communism. Well, let's just become like the West. They have a successful model that works, right? Why try and fix communism? It's not working. Let's just be like the capitalist liberal democracies of Europe and the United States. And so this leads to an implosion of the system, right? Right before it, let's just imitate the West since they're doing such a good job. And you can see this, how much people lost faith in this system in Europe. Between 1989 and 1991, all the Eastern Bloc countries, places like Poland and the Soviet republics, those all became independent, and none of them chose to stay communist, right? Not even Russia chose to stay communist. And Gorbachev will refuse to use force to save the Soviet Union. When everything's falling apart, unlike in the past, he won't send in the army, right? He won't act to save communism. He kind of even has lost some faith in it. What did Francis Fukuyama mean by the end of history? Why was he wrong? So after the fall of the Soviet Union, people like me, we thought, okay, great, we won. History's kind of over. Clearly, Western liberal democracy is the best system. So now everyone's just going to follow it. So we don't really need history anymore in a sense, because now we figured out the perfect system, and everything's okay. And we were completely wrong, right? There's still problems, right? There's still a lot of problems in the world. Francis Fukuyama and people like me at the time, we thought everything was fixed. Now we got rid of the Soviet Union and communism. Nope, we were wrong. Still continues. And one other thing we were wrong about, right, was that we thought communism will fall in China just like it did the Soviet Union. We were completely wrong. Right? It's now 30 years later, and the Chinese Communist Party is still going strong in China. So that raises this question, right? Why did that not happen? Why didn't it become fall? Well, we can kind of get a clue to that, right? We had this question, what caused the pro-democracy protests at Tiananmen, and how did the Chinese Communist government deal with them? And remember, what fundamentally caused those problems was that China had undertaken capitalist reforms, not political reforms, only capitalist reforms. Gorbachev tried to do everything, political and economic at the same time, bad idea. The Communist Party kept power but brought in more capitalist economic reforms. And those worked to increase China's productivity and efficiency, but they caused economic problems, especially uneven economic development. Some people got rich, some people got really good jobs, other people stayed poor and could not find jobs. Whereas before in China, everyone had jobs and was kind of equally poor. Now you have some people getting really, really rich, and then you have some people staying very poor. So that made people angry, and that led to some people say, you know what, we'll fix our economic problems, liberal democracy. So they have a protest in Tiananmen Square in 1989, led by students. Non-students will join, right? And you can see what a threat they are. I showed you that statue. Remember that? That statue is in Canada, at my university, University of British Columbia, right in front of the Student Union. And this is a model of what the Chinese actually made, and the students made during the protest, and it's of the Chinese version of the Statue of Liberty. Right? It's the Chinese version of the Statue of Liberty. So they, what can I say? They were wanting Western democracy to deal with these economic problems. The government, though, crushed this movement, right? Killed a bunch of people, ordered the people to leave as they were leaving Tiananmen Square. They attacked, killing students and also the non-students who had joined them, right? You saw that literally from that video. You saw there were lots of types of people who were in trouble. We're not sure how many people died because China is still a closed society. They don't allow research on this. Question 17, why do people accept one-party communist rule in China, right? Why haven't we seen a Tiananmen Square recently? And what term best describes the Chinese political economic system? First of all, what the term describes it, I like to call it red capitalism. And what that means is you have a capitalist economy controlled by the Communist Party, which sounds really weird, but that's how it works. Right? You have a capitalist economy run by a Communist Party. Right? So how do they justify this, right? Well, first of all, continued economic development. Right? They continued to develop economically. Right? They continued to develop economically. And what thing they did was they distributed the fruit of that economic development more equally. Right? They distributed the wealth of the fruit of that economic labor more equally, which dealt with that problem. Right? The idea is people rebelled or launched this pro-democracy movement for economic reasons. Well, hey, you know what? Maybe we should, if we deal with those economic problems, they won't want democracy anymore. So the Chinese communists have continued economic development, but they've made sure it's distributed more equally. So more people get part of that. In addition, they can say, you know what? We made China strong. China was a weak country. People looked down on us. But now we're a strong country that people have to take seriously. And that happened under our rule. Remember, China was so weak during the Opium War that a single British ship helped the British, this tiny country, defeat them, right? The British had that steamship, the Nemesis. That was sufficient to make them to defeat them, right? But now by 1949, after the communists take over, they build a strong China, which people have to take seriously, right? No one can bully China. And a lot of Chinese people say, yeah, that's right. They made us strong. We should continue to kind of follow them. And one thing I want to stress, Chinese people have a good deal of freedom. The Chinese government does not tell them, you cannot wear jeans. As a Chinese person, you can live a lot of your life perfectly with perfect freedom, as long as you don't tread into the political sphere too much. And even then, you can do that a bit. But if you do go too far, right, you could face censorship or even force. You could even be thrown in prison. One thing I think is interesting, you know how you can find on Wikipedia, right, how many Americans were executed this year? In China, that's a state secret. Right? The government does not release how many people were executed. It's considered a state secret. So it would be illegal, it would get you in a lot of trouble if you were to reveal that information. So China's interesting, right? We have an authoritarian government with a capitalist economy. Is that going to stay like that? I don't know. What will happen in the future, we don't know. But it will be interesting.